I had a grant at a university in the United States to have a year just to write, and to write anything I wanted to. And I'd been working on a very specific play, which later became a play of mine called I Am My Own Wife, and I applied for the grant with a proposal for that play, and that was the play I was going to write. And I got to the university and settled in my office and had a terrible case of writer's block. And I couldn't seem to get anywhere on this play that I'd intended to work on. But there were other things happening in the culture at the time, and I sometimes think that when the socio-political merges with the personal, sometimes you get art as a result. And at that time, there were all kinds of ferocious arguments happening in the United States about the nature of art and art funding by the government, and should controversial or subversive art receive government support. And this became a very loud argument in our country. And on one side, you had this conservative senator, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, who insisted that perverse art should not be rewarded with government funding. And on the other side, you had the object of his wrath, and that was the late photographer Robert Mapplethorpe, whose provocative, especially homoerotic images were being exhibited around the country. And so I was listening to this debate, and I was amused in a sense that Jesse Helms and Robert Mapplethorpe were always cast in an adversarial way, because when I thought about it, it seemed to be a very symbiotic relationship, because every time Helms railed against Mapplethorpe's work, he'd get more donations to his political funds, and it worked like a charm. And when the estate of Robert Mapplethorpe, who was deceased, but when the estate would rail against Jesse Helms, they'd get more museums showing the work, and they ultimately wound up with beautiful coffee table books at Barnes & Noble. And I thought, so who's losing? Both parties seemed to be winning, and I thought, how interesting that the censor often becomes the artist's muse, and it's a very symbiotic and close relationship, and that in some sense they derive power from one another. And so I wanted to write a play on that subject. And at about the same time, so that was what was happening socio-politically. And then personally, I had been dating a very dear man who was also a professional psychiatrist. And and we would have late night conversations about the nature of the world and living in it. And so arguably, he was the optimistic mental health professional, or colmier, and I was the irascible and argumentative writer, or sod. Christmas came, and as a Christmas gift, he gave me Maurice Leve's biography of Sod, which I should have known would augur the death of the relationship, but in fact, I read the book, and I thought, well, I'm going to write my breakup play, and instead of being about Dr. McDowell and Doug Wright, it's going to be about Colmier and Sod. So I was fueled not only by a desire to address cultural trends I saw playing out in the country, but also to address the very personal rupture of this relationship in my life, which had been an important one. And those two things came together to provide the raw clay of Quills.
And tell us a bit about Marquis de Sade, because of course in the French-speaking world, of course we all know that name, we all know that sadism is from Sade, who actually was more of a masochist than a sadist, which is so true paradox. But so we know a bit about Marquis de Sade, but we don't really know our Marquis here in Quebec. Some people have seen, maybe read. But it took a while for me to read Marquis de Sade, even though I knew the titles and I knew the references. Tell us a bit about Marquis de Sade.
Sure, he's interesting to talk about because in some ways he's a potent Rorschach, and a lot of people have appropriated him to speak to their cause. I think that's a measure of his complexity, if you will. But he was born in 1740. He lost his parents at a relatively early age and was raised by his uncle, the Abbé de Sade, who was both an uncle but a bit of a libertine behind the scenes, and reportedly had a very negative effect on Sade's moral evolution. And so he was a tertiary nobleman. He wasn't of enormous high standing, but he wasn't of low standing either. He had a relatively undistinguished childhood, but wanted to become a man of letters. And his most ardent wish was to become a playwright, which I find amusing. And he wrote a number of plays that were routinely rejected by the Comédie Française. Then it was in his early sort of faltering literary life that he started to write short stories. I don't think it was until he was imprisoned, and he spent 32 years of his life in prison for a series of sex crimes that he committed and for his writing, which Napoleon took a fierce objection to. And I think it was primarily in prison that he started to write the really Baroque pornography that became his signature. And I would say that if you have not read Sade, and I can't say this strongly enough, it remains, 300, 400 years later, the most pornographic, disturbing, extreme literature that certainly Western culture has ever produced. We all flatter ourselves very modern, and we think that we live in a shock-free culture, and we think every taboo has been broken, and many have built celebrity on the breaking of taboos. But I guarantee you, nothing you've read or seen before will come close to what you read in Sade. And that's what makes him so potent. And over the years, as I said, various contingencies have claimed him. Like there are feminists like Annie Lebrun and even Simone de Beauvoir who maintain that Sade was the first true feminist, not a misogynist at all, but a feminist because he gave women unapologetic sexual agency and let them be as despicable as men. And that was a kind of progressive point of view. Others, like the literary critic out of Harvard, Roger Shattuck, have said he should not be published. And when he was finally admitted into the French literary canon only a few years ago, there was a storm of protest against it because so many feel that he doesn't merit that kind of attention. And I have a lot of complicated feelings about it because, and I'm talking as much about the writing as I am about the man, which may not really cut to the core of your question. But I'm still very torn about Sade in terms of his literary merit. And I think there are passages that are as brilliant as any satire in Jonathan Swift. And there are passages that are literally mind-numbing pornography that go on for pages and pages and pages. So when I think of his worth to us, I think in a way he's most valuable as a portrait in human extremis. And by that I mean, when you track his pornography over 32 years of imprisonment, it gets progressively more extreme. And I think as someone who was living in isolation, what amused him on the third day of his captivity wasn't really doing its job by, the 2075th day of captivity. So in order to titillate himself, he had to push the margins of his own sexual desire and his own imagination. So in some sense, I think that the literary quality of the writing is somehow at times less important to me than the portrait of the very darkest kind of human psychology. And I think it's easy to say, what's the point of looking at the basest drives in human nature? But I think it's crucial that we do so, right? Because Sadean acts are committed all the time, even today. I've been working on another project about Vietnam, and you look at some of the war atrocities that occurred by corn-fed Midwestern American boys who had never even touched Sade, and they rival the acts in his fiction. So I think Sade is a necessary subject for study for that reason alone. And I think if you're so frightened by his literature, you don't go near it, then he's essentially won. And the best thing to do is face it down on its own terms. And so I think all of my conflicting feelings about him made him an especially ripe subject for the play, and I hope all of those perspectives are represented in it somehow. If I come to a conclusion about him, the play would be propaganda. I hope that's not the case. I'm still as vexed about him now as I was 25 years ago when I wrote it.
So, Doug, we're sitting in front of a group of people who are studying, of course, right now, but that eventually will be either acting in plays, in the TV sitcoms, the TV series, and film. So, what can you say to help me convince them to only do theater? What's the advantage, or what's the great difference between writing for the stage and writing for the screen, for example, and what it demands of actors and the difference of that?
Well, that's such a good question. I will first say that certainly working as a playwright as opposed to a screenwriter, you get the remarkable privilege of sometimes, when you're very, very lucky, having your work interpreted by some of the major world figures in our craft. And there's nothing more thrilling than that. And I have to say, you all have just seen the dress rehearsal, but I hope you'll agree with me when I say it is a truly definitive production of the play and masterfully performed by both Robert and your instructor and the rest of the cast. So that's one of the great thrills, and certainly when you make a movie, you make it once and it's done. And I get to see Quills revisited by some of the best minds in our field, which is profoundly humbling and thrilling. I would also say, it's interesting, I went through this year, and it was very illuminating for me. I had a play in production, and I had a film that was shooting, and they were happening at exactly the same time. And just to give you a snapshot of that experience, in the theater, I was in rehearsal every day. I was chatting with the actors about each line and their intention when they said it. We were improvising moments and scenes so that I could then capture them and put them in the text to make the scene more authentic and more true. I selected every actor in the show with the director at my side in auditions, because as a playwright in the States, you have that privilege. I was working with the designer, telling her the various images that came to my mind before she began, so that she could take whatever I could offer and incorporate it in her own way. And I was firing on every cylinder that I have. And we lived through previews, and the show opened, and it had my blood in it to the most extreme degree. It was exhilarating. The movie, the director took the script from me and did a final polish on it. They went to New Orleans to film it. They emailed me the names of the people in the cast, and they flew me down for one day, and I got to go to the set, and they were filming a very crucial scene. I watched the American film star Jamie Foxx, if you know him. I watched him open and close a door for 20 takes. And then they took me for a very expensive dinner, and they sent me home. They're currently doing test screenings of the movie all over the United States. And the one person, they're showing it to strangers and having them rate it. Like, which moments did you like? Which moments did you not like? So they can then do a kind of edit by committee. And the one person they've not shown the film to is the writer. So if you ask me which profession I prefer, but I also remember, in terms of actors and what you're asked to do, I don't know if this anecdote is illustrative of anything or just me being a little snarky, but I'll never forget the day we were shooting the film of Quills, and Joaquin Phoenix, who is an astonishing actor by any stretch. He's one of our best. And
He played Cormier.
Yes, he played Cormier, and he's a very dear and lovely man. But I will say, I smirked a bit when he came in one day and said to his colleague Jeffrey Rush, "Killer day. I have 5 pages of text."